Hey y'all, welcome back to my channel. Today I wanted to talk about something that I just haven't really seen touched on that well throughout YouTube. So I love thrifting and vintage shopping, and there are just some tips and tricks for plus size vintage thrifting and shopping that are my go-tos, and I just haven't really seen them touched on in other channels. And with stay-at-home orders lifting and some of us getting back out there and thrifting and doing vintage, or maybe you just discovered vintage over all this and are curious, some of these tips might help you as you go back out there, stay safe, and do a little treasure hunting. Also, some of these tips are great for everyone. I don't think all these are plus size specific, so yeah, these might be great for you too. So here we go. Okay, so my first tip is there are no rules. And that might seem like a total cop-out, but just bear with me right now. I think a lot of people, when they start doing vintage or when they think about incorporating vintage into their wardrobe, they think, oh my God, like, what if this piece of jewelry isn't real? What if this is a reproduction? How do I know if that purse at Goodwill is real? Oh my God, look at that YouTuber with their whole life is like vintage and perfect and amazing. And what you've got to realize is if you think something's fabulous, then it's fabulous. There really are no rules to vintage. And a lot of these people who have like fully curated lives have been doing it for decades. They have been hunting for decades. They didn't just step into it and all of a sudden, you know, become this amazing curated life of it. So yeah, just know there are no rules. And for me, vintage is about taking my favorite parts of each decade and taking it with me and utilizing it. And to get the best of each decade is wonderful. Like, I don't have to live in each decade. I can take the best from it. Another great plus size vintage tip is accessories. Accessories. Oh my God, I love vintage accessories and vintage jewelry. You can add them to an outfit and you can just take an outfit to the next level, you know? It just goes from feeling like an ordinary outfit to like vintage, to like really vintage. And I always joke that like accessories always fit. And for plus size, that's not always true, right? So, example, this cute little short necklace, right? It's adorable. It would go great with this dress I'm wearing, right? And it would really give it that vintage touch. But if I go to put it on, it doesn't fit. It's too small, right? So one of my vintage tricks for plus size is necklace extenders. They're super easy to find. They're at Michael's. I bet you can get them on Amazon too. I'll link below to some. And they make a necklace fit. They'll work on almost any necklace. Don't think the clasps have to match the clasps of the necklace that you're trying to fit. If there's a closure and a way to hook, it'll work. And there you go. See, the necklace fits perfect now, and it's because of the necklace extender. So I can wear that gorgeous vintage jewelry I love, and it fits me. Also, really, you can just add accessory after accessory and it'll make an outfit feel more and more vintage, okay? So watch when I add one accessory. Now let's add two accessories. Got my little vintage purse here. Now let's add another vintage accessory. Here we are. And let's do one more just for the heck of it. And I added these gloves. See, you just add a bunch of accessories and it takes the outfit more and more vintage as you go. Also, mini pro tip, if you really want to make a purse, if you have that vintage flair, no matter what the age of the purse is, tie a scarf onto it and even add like a brooch. It just gives it that vintage flair look. So remember, it doesn't matter what the accessory is or how expensive it is. If you love it and you feel confident in it, that's the point of vintage. It can be some basic beads, some crazy 70s feel, Or you can go with a little more high-priced items like gorgeous jeweled bangles or some sterling silver and turquoise. But if you feel confident, that's the important thing with accessories. So the next plus size vintage tip I have is cardigans. Cardigans are a great place to step your toe into vintage clothing. And why I love cardigans so much is they hang open, right? So even if something is a little smaller, it still looks good on you. In fact, one of my favorite cardigans is a set that would never fit me. This set I picked up for only $5 at one of my favorite stores. I would never fit into this smaller tank underpiece, but I can fit into the cardigan. And I get so many compliments when I wear this cardigan. And you can do all kinds of cardigans from all different eras and different looks. Something super feminine and flirty to something sultry. These are all great ways to add vintage flair without having to worry about sizing as much as other pieces. So my next tip is something I think a lot of people are afraid to do, but it's super important when buying vintage. Know your measurements. I keep this little guy right in my purse. I will put a link down below to it, but I keep this right in my purse. And I'm not an expert on how to get your measurements. I'm just not. There's hundreds of YouTube videos on how to do it. You also can find a shirt, a dress, something that fits you amazing, and you can find the measurements on there. Make sure that what you are measuring is not stretchy, and that's usually a really good place to start with your measurements. Also, what I do is I keep my measurements written down in my phone. So when I'm out thrifting, it's just right there at hand. And you know, I highly recommend taking this when you're looking for vintage items. For one, sometimes you could be in an antique store where they just don't have changing rooms. And even at a thrift store, like nobody wants to take a dress into the fitting room and then get super disappointed because it isn't fitting, right? So if you just measure it on the rack and you go, nope, that's not gonna fit me, you don't have to deal with dressing room disappointment. And that's a big deal for me. Also, knowing these measurements are great for online shopping, but online shopping is always a struggle, but your measurements will definitely help you. Also, be sure to keep in mind that vintage sizing are not the same as today's sizing. So don't necessarily look at the tag and think it's not for you. One of the greatest tips I heard about sizing was to start at the biggest size and work your way down. And I think that's such a great tip, especially for plus size. And the reason that is such a great tip is because even larger, more shapeless pieces, if you put a belt on that, it will look great on you. So don't be afraid to go for larger sizes and then see if they work for you if you put a belt on them. So my next tip is to know that eras repeat themselves. Often styles that were very popular come back about every 20 years. So you can probably find an item that harkens back to even older vintage trends. This is a great way to find a vintage style that is much older than the vintage piece you have. So this is a great example of a 90s does 70s. This has a very 70s look, but this is most likely a 90s dress. It's a great way to get that 70s look. This is still vintage, but it's not as old vintage as you think. So this dress is an 80s does 40s or an 80s does 50s, whatever you want to call it, and still a vintage dress. This is still 30 to 40 years old, and it looks amazing, but it definitely calls back to an older time period and an older style. By looking for trends and different styles that repeat themselves, you can put that fun vintage look into your wardrobe. And it doesn't just have to be like these full out reproduction kind of looking items. It can be items that just have a part of them that has a vintage feel. Maybe it just has a killer vintage pattern that really feels 70s and 80s. Look at this. Look at the collar detail on this dress. It feels very Jackie O, even though this is a modern dress. And this is one of my favorite dresses. This puppy has a cape. I mean, how vintage is that style and feel? But this is a modern dress. Even the dress I'm wearing right now is modern, but it has that vintage feel. So you can always get that vintage feel just by looking for patterns and different shapes in clothing and work it into your wardrobe that way. And when you think about patterns, cuts, and styles, patterns are a great way to spot a gem among the racks. If you only have a few minutes and you're just stopping into a thrift store, you can just quickly scan through racks for cool patterns that you're drawn to. My next vintage tip is something I think people overlook all the time. And it's as simple as go to the good places and go there often. I know that seems like a no-brainer, but really, go to the good places and go there often. The inventory is changing all the time. One of my favorite tips with thrifting, if you go to a thrift store and you're finding a bunch of clothes in your size that you really like, go back the next day, and the next day, and the next day. Go back days back to back, because they might not have one single donation all out at one time. Go back until it feels like you've actually exhausted that donation and there aren't any more from that particular person's clothing that they have donated. I think so often people think, you know, oh, I was just there last week, I don't need to go. But if you're finding good stuff, go back. My next tip is again about timing. Like, there is a little bit of magic when you run into that perfect item and you're just like, oh, it was waiting here for me. I mean, I love the treasure hunt, but really great timing is a great way to think about finding vintage. For one, seasons have no meaning. You have no idea when an antique store bought new vintage clothing from somebody or when somebody cleaned out their house. So if you're looking for a winter coat, look all year for a winter coat. If you're looking for summer wear, look all year for summer wear. There is no seasonal timing. So always be on the lookout with items that you are looking for. I in fact keep a running list on my phone just to remind myself what I am looking for. That being said, there are seasons that are better than others. Spring cleaning is real, y'all. And go back in late spring, early summer. That's always when I find my best finds. It's always the oldest stuff. It always feels like it's a very large donation with tons of really cool things. Spring cleaning is legit. Also, Halloween. Halloween is an amazing time to go to thrift stores. They put out all these things that they consider like over-the-top costume items. Sometimes they're just amazing vintage. So check out Halloween. I also recommend, formal wear. So like homecoming, prom time. Sometimes thrift stores will put out prom dresses that are actually vintage. And just think about now, as the stay-at-home orders are lifting, tons of people, including myself, cleaned out their house during this time because they were stuck inside. There is going to be so much great stuff out right now. So be safe, but when you can, just know this is a great time to go thrifting, and go thrifting for any item, not just summer items. So my next vintage tip is to check the men's section. Look at this groovy old hoodie. Oh my God. I die. This is lovely. So check the men's section, and not just for t-shirts and jeans. I think everybody looks for t-shirts and jeans, but belts, shoes, jackets, blazers, polos, the men's section has so many awesome styles that now are more unisex, but back in the day were considered men's items. So that can be a great place to find more extensive sizes and some great vintage finds. Be sure to check it out. So my final vintage tip is curation. And all this means is if you find something that works for you, stick with it and look for that something for guidance, okay? So if you find an online shop that always has perfect looks for you, message them, see if they can find more. Look at how they're styling things. If you look at somebody who curates vintage really well and it's working for you, that is a great place to look for your vintage and keep looking for your vintage. Also, there are vintage mystery boxes. I do the Redbird Vintage Box. They do an amazing job at curation, and it's a great way for me to get vintage items into my life that I know I will love. And just think about it. Favorite thrift store that always has great things. Favorite booth at an antique mall. Maybe there is like ModCloth or Poshmark or other online retailers that you know the sizing is great for you, you know the items are great for you. Rely on that curation. It can help you immensely so you don't have to do it all yourself. So bonus vintage tip is to surround yourself with vintage in your life. This has been so inspiring for me to just like keep the aesthetics around me, and it inspires me to find more and to think of cool ways on which I can use vintage in my wardrobe as well. So don't be afraid of putting vintage into your life. And that's it, you guys. I hope some of these tips were helpful for you. Yeah, I'd love to hear your tips. So if you would comment down below with plus size tips, share them. That would be majorly helpful for people. So if you haven't already, give me a like and a subscribe, and I will talk to you later. Bye, guys. To find more extensive style.
It's lunchtime. Make sure to drink water.
Okay, all right, here we go.